My name is Kati, and I'm the project coordinator of this center, and will be facilitating the webinar today. The NIMH-TTC is funded by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, to enhance the capacity of the behavioral health and other related workforces to deliver evidence-based and empirically supported practices to individuals with mental illnesses. Please visit the NIMH-TTC Network website for additional information at nhttcnetwork.org. Next slide, please. If you're interested in staying up to date with the events and products the Northeast and Caribbean NIMH-TTC is providing, please sign up to receive our email communications. You can sign up at the bit.ly link provided on the screen. Next slide, please. Following the webinar, you will be asked to complete a brief survey. We value this feedback and use it to improve our activities and inform future activities. The surveys are also important because our continued funding is linked to the completion of these surveys. So we thank you in advance for your feedback. Next slide, please. We also want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to our website along with the PowerPoint slides in the next couple of days. Next slide. We encourage you to interact with our presenters during the webinar by using the chat feature. Please post any comments or questions you have in the chat, and I will collect your questions as we go and ask them of the presenter during the Q&A time towards the end of the presentation. During the webinar, our presenter may pose questions to you, so please use the chat feature to answer those questions. Next slide, please. This presentation was prepared for the NIMH-TTC network under a cooperative agreement from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA. All material appearing in this presentation, except that taken directly from copyrighted sources, is in the public domain and may be reproduced or copied without permission from SAMHSA or the authors. Citation of the source is appreciated. The opinions expressed herein are the views of the presenters and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services, or SAMHSA. No official support or endorsement of DHHS, SAMHSA, for the opinions described in this presentation is intended or should be inferred. Next slide, please. Now let's begin our webinar. Today we have Dr. Philip Yanos. Dr. Yanos is a professor of psychology at John Jay College, City University of New York. He's an associate editor for the journal Stigma and Health and the director of clinical training for the Clinical Psychology PhD program at John Jay College and the Graduate Center. Dr. Yanos is the co-developer of Narrative Enhancement and Cognitive Therapy, a group-based treatment that addresses the effects of self-stigma among people with mental illness. This treatment approach has been translated into 7 languages. He is the author of over 100 articles and book chapters. The book Written Off, Mental Health Stigma and the Loss of Human Potential, and was the principal investigator on 2 recent large federally funded projects. Welcome, Dr. Yanos. I will turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Kati, and I hope that everyone's able to hear me okay. If for any reason there's any technical problem, you can announce that in the chat.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and I don't know if there's anybody who needs there to be some transcription or something like that. I don't know if that's a service that you offer, but that's something else that sometimes is helpful to folks, but just want to bring that up as a possibility. I know that Zoom can provide that at times.
Yes, this webinar will be posted to our YouTube page, and our YouTube page will generate the captions.
Okay, great. Okay, so yeah, so the title of my presentation is Illness, Identity, and Recovery from Serious Mental Illness, and I'm just going to cover a lot of ground of research that I've done over the years in this area and bring it up to the present day, and then see what your thoughts are about how this relates to the work that you do and ways that you can incorporate it into what you're doing. So yeah, my title is Professor. I'm at John Jay, which is part of City University of New York, which likes to call itself the greatest urban university in the world. And I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and I have the That the professor title and the director of clinical training sort of role right now. And I've written the book that was mentioned in my introduction. I also want to note that in addition to doing research and teaching and supervising and advising and all that kind of stuff that we do in academic settings, I've remained my clinical involvement in working with people with severe or serious mental illnesses since 1996. And so I currently work with what's called an assertive community treatment team for 1 day a week. I've kept on doing that. And it's something that I find to be very important to really kind of stay involved in what's going on in the service system. A little bit more about my personal history. So I actually grew up on the grounds of this place, and I don't know if anybody recognizes it, but this is called Manhattan Psychiatric Center. It's a state hospital that's located on an island in between East Harlem and Astoria, Queens, and the South Bronx. It's called Ward's Island. And it's a state hospital. And so my father worked there, and we lived on the grounds in houses that had been built roughly in this area here near this water tower you see. So all the houses are gone. They were knocked down sometime in the 80s. And these are now sports fields used by private school kids that the city has arrangements with. But I did grow up sort of in the mental health system and around deinstitutionalization and all the things that were going on at the time in the 70s. So it's helpful for me to get a little bit of a sense of about folks who are attending, and I know I don't have time to kind of get extensive answers, but I wonder if anyone is interested in putting something in the chat about what your background is, what type of settings you work in, reasons that you were interested in this training. Please feel free, and I'll take a look at that for the next couple of minutes. And so does anybody want to put that in the chat, please feel free. Okay, so I see someone is a creative arts therapist. Private practice with youth, care navigator at supportive housing agency. LMSW school therapist. CPS MH. Let's see, adult partial care. Right, so like a real range of settings. Some people working with youth, some people working inpatient, social workers, psychiatric rehabilitation practitioners, school psychologists, certified peer specialists, treatment court, right? So a range of settings seems that people are involved in. Thanks for sharing those. So I hope that there'll be something here that will be relevant to everybody who's here. Obviously, it'll be most relevant to people who are working with people with what are called psychiatric disabilities or serious mental illnesses the most. But you know, hopefully there'll be something here that even those of you working with younger individuals will find valuable. Okay, so going to get back with the slide presentation. Okay, so just a warning is, you know, I am at home, and if there is a problem with the internet, which hopefully won't happen, you know, hang in there and it will restart. So I'm trying to be in the best position in my home to have a good signal, but if it happens, you know, we'll deal with it. And I've gotten through it in the past, and I hope we'll get through it now if it happens again. Okay, so what am I going to do? I'm going to start with an overview of how community stigma leads to what we'll call stigma concern and self-stigma. I could talk about that more, but didn't have enough time to really do as much of a discussion of that as I do typically when I present on this topic. So we're just going to discuss that briefly, and then we're going to move on to what we call self-stigma, and we're going to define illness identity and explain how it impacts the recovery process. And so then we're going to talk about what we can do about it. We're going to talk about peer-led and professional approaches to addressing self-stigma. including narrative enhancement and cognitive therapy, which I know the most about since I've been a co-developer of it. So what do we mean when we talk about stigma, when we use that term? Well, one sort of conceptualization that I think is helpful is to think of it as an umbrella term that captures a lot of things. And according to Bruce Link and Joe Phelan's definition, it includes elements of labeling, stereotyping, separation, status loss, and discrimination co-occurring in a power situation. So one thing that's important to note is that sometimes people say, well, why do you say stigma? Why don't you say prejudice? Why don't you say discrimination? Well, those things are included within it. The term stigma captures this range of processes, including labeling, discrimination, prejudice, and then also these other things that we'll get into more, the internalization of stigma, the concern about stigma, et cetera. Where it starts, and it's important to be aware of, is this idea that a person has a label, and that label is linked to negative stereotypes, and then it comes to be something that people who know that that individual has the label immediately assume that they are characteristics that they have. So in the case of the label of mental illness, the negative stereotypes that are most common are assumptions that the person would be violent, unpredictable, incompetent, unable to work or function, and unable to get better. And some might question whether or not this is still the case. Have we seen some progress in this area? Aren't people much more aware of mental health issues? Well, when we're thinking about serious mental illness, especially schizophrenia, there isn't actually any evidence for improvement in this area, and there's actually strong evidence for things getting worse. So between 1996 and 2018, there hasn't been a decrease in Americans' endorsement of the belief that people with mental illness, schizophrenia especially, are dangerous and a desire to maintain social distance from them. And we also haven't seen this globally in reviews from other countries between the 80s and the 2000. There is evidence that some countries have seen improvement related to national anti-stigma campaigns. I don't have time to go into that today, but I do believe that there are some other paths that our country could have chosen. Specifically from Pesco-Solido and colleagues' report in 2019, you can see here this bar here, I don't know what color that is, turquoise, I guess, has increased from, this is for the 2018 numbers, and 1996 is red. So you can see how there's been this steadily worsening view toward people with schizophrenia. And there have also been worsening views toward people with major depression as well. So we have pretty strong evidence that it's not getting better, it's getting worse. So for the sake of our presentation today, the important issue is, do people who are getting services, people who are diagnosed, are they aware of it? Because this is going to bring it down to the issue of, does it affect them in any way? And so studies are very clear in showing that the great majority of mental health service users are aware of stigma, and roughly 70% anticipate discrimination. In addition, studies that ask people what they think most people believe find that 60 to 70% of people diagnosed with mental illness believe that most people hold stigmatized views and would reject a person with a mental illness as a friend, etc. We'll get into that a little bit more in a bit. And so this is data from Graham Thornycroft's international study of anticipated discrimination. And I think what's notable here that I want to point your attention to is that the largest bar here, 34%, anticipated discrimination but had not experienced it. And so what that indicates is certainly experiencing discrimination is going to heighten your attention to the possibility of being discriminated against again in the future, but it doesn't have to have occurred. And there's a specific reason for that in our understanding of this. And that's basically because Bruce Link introduced this modified labeling theory which indicates that people absorb these stereotypical attitudes during childhood in the socialization process. So they don't have to ever have been directly discriminated against or put down in order to be concerned about it. So in the words of one individual whose narrative I read, he said, there was a person in my school who made fun of every single mental illness. He was talking about being in an abnormal psychology class in undergraduate, made fun of every mental illness and every treatment. And that person was me. And I remember being in the hospital after I'd experienced my first episode of mania and thinking, are other people thinking that about me? So because we absorb these views during childhood in the socialization process, we don't have to be directly told that someone else thinks that about us. There's an assumption that it's going to happen. And so then when you are diagnosed later on, there's this process of thinking, oh no, this applies to me, and I bet others are thinking this too. So this is sort of just a simplified, illustration of the modified labeling perspective, that we have awareness of negative stereotypes along with the diagnosis, and now the stereotypes take on personal relevance, which I call stigma concern. So now you're thinking about it, and you're kind of in the heads of other people in terms of how they're looking at you. So does this automatically have a detrimental effect on people that we work with, mental health service users? Not automatically. And Pat Corrigan and Amy Watson sort of detailed 3 possible responses to awareness of stigma among mental health service users that I think are useful for us to look at now and think about the different types of ways that people are responding to this awareness of stigma. So the first is what they called indifference, and indifference can occur when someone has low identification with the group, and it doesn't matter if they think that stereotypes are legitimate or not. So when I say low group identification, this could be that they don't think that they have a mental illness, or it could also be that they believe that they do, but they think that they are somehow different from others in that category. So this could be sort of a shrugging, it doesn't apply to me, I don't care response. Righteous anger occurs among individuals who have high group identification, so identify as a member of the group. I have a mental illness, or I identify as somebody who is a survivor, or somebody who has a history of treatment, but they reject the legitimacy of the stereotypes. And so in this case, a person's going to take an activist stance and reject the stereotypes and kind of stand up to them. Although many professionals might view this as a negative, because we think of anger as a negative, generally this is a positive here, in that this is a stance of somebody that somebody takes when they're rejecting stigma, and they're rejecting what we might think of as systemic oppression. So usually this is going to be a positive, and this is probably something you would see in a lot of people who are in the peer movement, or the consumer survivor ex-patient movement. Finally, there's self-stigma, and so this occurs when someone both identifies as a member of the group, yes, I have a mental illness, or yes, I'm a member of this category of people, and then they also believe that stereotypes are legitimate. Yes, it's true that people with mental illness are dangerous, incompetent, unable to recover, etc. And this is going to lead to what we'll call self-stigma. So I'm going to bring the word identity in here because I think that it's kind of intimately entwined in this whole issue. And so what do we mean by identity? Well, generally speaking, this applies to social categories that people use to describe themselves and that others use to describe them. And what we learn from sociology is that, and this from the sort of symbolic interactionist theory, is that we're impacted by what other people think of us, right? So, I might think of myself as a a father, New Yorker, psychologist, Greek American, and a competent professional. But if I'm made aware, maybe I look at my professor ratings or something like that, that people think of me as a, self-important blowhard or something like that, that's going to start to eat into my self-awareness in some way, especially if I'm exposed to it repeatedly. So, people define themselves a number of ways. I have some examples there, but they are also influenced by the categories that others impose on us, right? And so this is going to be relevant for thinking about what happens to people who might have some self-definitions that are completely independent of having a mental health problem, but then the mental health problem starts to really dominate, especially as others are imposing that on. So when we're thinking about self-stigma, what we're calling self-stigma, we're really going to be thinking about a process by which the identity of having a mental illness takes over and supersedes other identity categories that the people that we work with have, whether it's related to their racial ethnic group, their religion, veteran status, their family status, or their skills and talents they have, being a musician or an artist, religion, and the like. So the first time the term self-stigma was used in the professional literature was by a person with lived experience, Kathleen Gallo. She wrote this personal account in the journal Schizophrenia Bulletin, and it was titled Self-Stigmatization. And so I'm just going to read you an excerpt from it. So she wrote, I perceive myself quite accurately, unfortunately, as having a serious mental illness, and therefore as having been relegated to what I call the social garbage heap. I tortured myself with the persistent repetitive thought that people I would encounter, even total strangers, not like me, and wished that mentally ill people like me did not exist. Thus, I would do things such as standing away from others at bus stops and hiding and cringing in the far corners of subway cars. Thinking of myself as garbage, I would even leave the sidewalk in what I thought as exhibiting the proper deference to those above me in social class. The latter group, of course, included all other human beings. So the key here in terms of thinking about self-stigma is not only that she was believed or expected that others would discriminate against her, that others looked down on her, but that she thought of herself as garbage, that she thought that this was something that she was deserving of. That's really what captures what we mean when we're thinking of self-stigma. So the literature on self-stigma really took off when there were scales developed that would allow us to measure it. And so sort of the one that really had the biggest impact on the field was Jennifer Richer's internalized stigma of mental illness inventory. Now she goes by Jennifer Boyd, but she was Jennifer Richer at the time. And so that really spawned quite a bit of research activity on internalization of stigma or self-stigma. Pat Corrigan also developed the self-stigma of mental illness scale, which many people prefer, and there's a short form of it. And there's some other scales that have been developed that are much less used, such as the modified engulfment scale and the self-stigma of depression scale. So just a little bit of information on the internalized stigma of mental illness scale. It has some subscales, items that capture different aspects of this complex construct. So some of them tap into stereotype endorsement. So sort of a person is basically asked about their endorsement of negative stereotypes about mental illness, so such as mentally ill people tend to be violent, or because I have a mental illness, I need others to make most decisions for me. There are other items that tap into what we can think of as alienation, such as I'm embarrassed or ashamed that I have a mental illness. And then there's some positively worded items that are make up the stigma resistance scale, and there are items such as people with mental illness make important contributions to society. So what do we find when we give this to people? I guess before I go to the next slide, I'm curious what people think. What proportion of individuals getting services in the public mental health system would endorse like high scores on this measure? Does anybody want to venture some hypotheses about that? Could just put down a percentage or something like that. Okay, what proportion of people would endorse high scores on this measure? What'd you expect? Okay, so one person said 50, 60%, 80. Okay, so a lot of high expectations for a lot of self-stigma among people. Okay, 85, 90, right? So I'm seeing things going high rather than going low. So these are actually overestimates, but this is based on a fairly conservative take on sort of definition of what a good cutoff is on this scale. And so, let me go to the next slide. So basically, using sort of the more conservative cutoffs, we find that it's about 20 to 40%. And so the biggest study that was done was this 14 country study of in Europe, and they looked at both people who had a diagnosis of schizophrenia and people with diagnosis of bipolar disorder, depression, and about 40% of those with diagnosis of schizophrenia had elevated internalized stigma, and about 22% of those with bipolar disorder or depression did. There was recently a review doing of studies around the world on the prevalence of self-stigma. This was done by Julien de Brec in France, and they found that it was an average of about 31% across all these studies. So we can kind of put it at about a third. And this doesn't suggest that most people develop self-stigma or stigmatized identities, but it suggests that it's a significant subgroup that we really want to be more concerned about and we want to help and reach out to. So the next question that's important is, does it matter, right? There's a lot of other things people are dealing with. They're dealing with symptoms, they're dealing with substance use often, they're dealing with discrimination as a result of stigma, right? They're dealing with problems in the system that leads to housing instability and the like, right? So is this really important? Well, when Pat Corrigan and Amy Watson initially came up with their three-part theory about self-stigma, they hypothesized that it would lead to this diminished self-esteem and self-efficacy, and these were important. So where I and my colleagues come in is where we thought that it was actually a much more profound impact that it had. And so this is where my colleagues David Rowe and Paul Lysacker and I started thinking about this about 12, 13 years ago. And we came up with this illness identity model that I'm going to describe for you now. And so basically, this is the paper that we published that describes the illness identity model. It came out after some of the research, but it was submitted before. It's just sometimes it's funny like that. And so basically what this is a model, a conceptual model that proposes that there's this profound impact on a number of different areas that occurs as a result of the combination of endorsement of self-stigma and awareness of having a psychiatric problem. And that this has an immediate impact on hope and self-esteem, which then has cascading effects both immediately on suicide risk, increasing risk for suicide, decreasing engagement in rehabilitation services, and leading to more avoidant coping. And that this has an impact on social interaction, so people become more socially isolated and avoidant. And that these also have impacts on vocational outcomes, so reduced likelihood of engagement in work and ability to keep a job, and then indirectly on symptom severity. So what we were thinking was that we didn't believe that internalized stigma causes symptoms, but we believe that it makes symptoms worse because people become more disengaged in services. We have what Pat Corrigan called the why try phenomenon. Why bother? Why should I invest effort in taking this medication? Being involved in all these rehab services, it's not going to make a difference if I'm not going to get better. And so symptoms are going to get worse when people aren't socially interacting, when they're not working or involved in other productive activity that also can heighten symptoms. So these were the things that we thought, and we thought that this would be kind of having this profound effect on recovery-related outcomes. So I think I just summarized that, so I don't need to reiterate it. So I'm just going to quickly show you a video clip from a guy named Mads Trierblom, who from Denmark, who I've met and had the chance to hang out with a little bit. He does these presentations in Denmark about his lived experience, and he was nice enough to translate a bit of it for into English. And so I'm just going to show you a short bit that I think is a good illustration of how illness identity impacts people. So hopefully this will work. All right, maybe I should do stop share on that and go to the, oh. Okay, so you should be seeing Mads' face, and I will play it and hopefully the sound will work, and let me know if it doesn't.
This is experience of being seen as a diagnosis. I see it as a bad circle. Your doctor gives you the diagnosis, and you feel this kind of stigma being a person with bipolar, and it makes you become self-stigmatizing. You put yourself into this box, and suddenly your life gets smaller. The things you don't do because you have this diagnosis, and your self-esteem is getting lowered. And when you go back to the doctor and explain that, he says, well, but you're bipolar, so that's why. And then you're caught in this bad circle.
So one of the things that I think is really helpful for us in terms of what Mads is talking about is that the low self-esteem ends up getting seen as a symptom, right? But it's a function of not of the disorder itself, but of self-stigma, of being put into this box and then kind of seeing oneself as part of this denigrated category. Okay, so I'm going to continue. Okay, so we then started to do research on, I think I had another, yeah, okay, so then we started to do research on these issues that we wanted to get into. And the first paper that we did was really kind of the one that's been most highly cited of all the papers I've ever done. And this is where we talked about something that we decided to call the insight paradox, and a lot of people like that, and they've used it since. And so basically, what we looked at here was this idea that insight is kind of this celebrated thing among professionals, but there was a fair amount of research that showed that it's also associated with negative outcomes, depression and hopelessness, depending on the study, although it also is associated with positive outcomes at times. And so what we wanted to see was, does self-stigma explain this? Is it really depend on, the combination between self-stigma and insight? So that's what the study was. And so I'm just going to give you a quick explanation because I know this isn't necessarily a research audience. And so basically we use something called cluster analysis, and we divided this group of people who had a diagnosis of schizophrenia, and we had measures of insight and self-stigma with them into 3 groups based on whether they had high insight and high self-stigma, high insight and low self-stigma, or low insight and low stigma. And I mean, you could think of it as this is sort of the stigmatized identity group. This might be righteous anger, and this might be indifference, right? And so basically what we found was the group with the high insight, high self-stigma had the lowest self-esteem, the lowest scores on the measures of hope, the impaired social relationships to the extent that were similar to the low insight group, and positive symptoms, which is those delusions, hallucinations, that were also similar to the low insight group. And so partly what this indicates is that insight is not beneficial if you combine it with self-stigma. However, it is beneficial if you combine it with a rejection of self-stigma. And if you're going to have, and that self-stigma puts you in a worse position than a person with a low insight and low self-stigma overall, because at least then self-esteem and hope are sort of retained. This was kind of the main take-home message from that study. And many people have kind of tried to see if it replicates, and I'll give you a little overview of what we found over the years from others. Okay, so that's a summary. I think I said that already. We then did something called a path analysis, where we looked at if most of our model was supported using this statistical approach called path analysis. And so we didn't have everything in it, but we had a lot of it. And we found that largely the relationships were supported. So there was this strong negative relationship between internalized stigma and hope and self-esteem. And then this was related to depressive symptoms. We didn't have suicidality, unfortunately, to include in that, or fortunately. We saw there was a strong relationship with avoidant coping, social avoidance, and then there was this indirect relationship with positive symptoms, the delusions and hallucinations that I mentioned ago. We were really interested in the work part, so we also did a study where we had individuals who were involved in vocational rehabilitation, and we were able to see if self-stigma impacted the trajectory of their improvement over time. So that's the last study I'm going to mention. And basically what we found was that baseline self-stigma controlling for symptoms, right? You always want to control for statistically for things that might explain a relationship, was negatively related to improvement in vocational functioning 5 months after. And so basically, you know, the reason why this is particularly important is because everybody in this sample had been given a work assignment. They were all kind of involved in this vocational rehab program. And so what happened was people with more self-stigma were less likely to stay in work. They were more likely to drop out, more likely to not be showing up consistently for work and the like. And so this indicated that it has kind of this impact on people feeling like, what's the point? Why should I put in this effort into trying to work, trying to benefit in a way that would further recovery? Okay, so I think I explained that. And now I'm just going to give you some takes, because all of this stuff was done over 10 years ago. So back in 2010, Livingston and Boyd, that's the Jennifer Richer, she had changed her name to Boyd at that point. They conducted a meta-analysis of 127 studies that looked at the consequences of self-stigma. And they found these significant effects for hope, self-esteem, self-efficacy, quality of life, symptom severity, treatment adherence, and social support. So very consistent with some of the things we found in our path analysis. And so now, 10 years after that, Gonzalez-Sanguino and some other researchers did a meta-analysis of 45 studies conducted since 2010, and they found very similar relationships, maybe a little bit weaker for self-esteem, subjective quality of life, hope, depressive symptoms, and subjective recovery. So there are these kind of enduring findings from studies conducted around the world, or the impact of self-stigma on all of these different outcomes. We also did a review that we just published this end of this last year of studies that tested some aspect of what we call the illness identity model. And so we ended up including 111 studies in this review. We basically focused on between 2010 and 2019. And so just to give you a view of the scope of it, it was 111 studies, were 23,000 participants, 43 countries. 16 of the studies were prospective, meaning they had more than one time point. So most of the studies were just cross-sectional, one point in time. And there was some diversity in the sample. Some had just people with diagnosis of schizophrenia or schizophrenia spectrum disorders. Others were mixed serious mental illness. Some were mixed mental illness. Some were first episode psychosis or clinical high risk in an emerging area. And some were just bipolar disorder or depression. And basically what we found is that the majority of studies supported the links that we had laid out in the illness identity model. And these support was particularly strong for hope, self-esteem, treatment adherence, social interaction, symptom severity. There were a lot fewer studies that looked at suicide risk or avoidant coping, but those studies were still largely supportive of these connections. And the insight paradox, which is that thing where the effects of insight can be positive or negative depending on self-stigma, had more mixed support. And we've tried to figure that out with using some other statistical analyses, and I can talk to folks about that later if they're interested, but we have some ways to explain why that might be the case. So largely our illness identity model has been supported. And really what countries they were done in didn't matter. The type of sample didn't really matter. So it seemed like it was pretty consistent across these different parts of the world that have studied this, and including studies in Asia, Africa, certainly Europe, certainly North America, very little in South America for some reason. Okay, so I think I summarized this already, that the relationships were consistently supported. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to shift gears toward what can we do about it. And I'm just giving you this kind of summary of the scope of the problem as I see it. So negative stereotypes are commonly endorsed by community members, right? So we know in the US, 70% of people expect someone with a diagnosis of schizophrenia to be violent. We know that people with mental illness expect discrimination, typically. We know that about a third or more people with a diagnosis of mental illness have internalized stigma to the extent that we can think of it as clinically significant. And we know that self-stigma is associated with a range of negative outcomes related to recovery. So at this point, it brings up this issue of like, well, what are we going to do about it? Are we going to address this in our services? And so I'll try to quickly give you some ideas for what we can do, both in the peer and professional sectors. So the first thing is that peer services have been working on this for a long time, before we had any terms about self-stigma. Going back to the 70s, the original peer services were focusing on transforming identity. And so the language of empowerment, which came out of a lot of that work, especially in the 80s, also implies this idea of transforming identity, transforming your self-definition. So I've always been interested in the impact of peer services, especially interacting with someone who can be a role model for a different way of conceptualizing a mental health issue or diagnosis. And so this is just a diagram from the Icarus project, which uses "you are not alone" and really kind of exemplifies some of the sense of belonging. So we did a study a few years ago with Baltic Street AEH, which is a large peer-run service system in New York City. And what we did is we looked to see if participating actively in peer support services facilitated reductions in self-stigma and related things. And so basically, this was a naturalistic study that looked at people who had just started. So we found people who were brand new, and we followed them up over 6 months, and we looked at who stayed and who didn't, and what was different about folks who stayed and the folks who didn't. So we used attendance data that Baltic Street had. And essentially what we found was that being a moderate or high attender in services was associated with significant decreases in internalized stigma and increases in self-esteem and self-efficacy relative to the minimal or not attender. So this suggested that being involved in peer support services did have a positive impact. But again, this wasn't a randomized study, it was a naturalistic study. And again, we were focusing on new folks and within that 6-month window. So there has been some other research that's looked at peer-provided services and whether they impact self-stigma and empowerment. And they were included in a meta-analysis that was published in 2019 by Burke et al. And so basically the findings from the meta-analysis was that group-based peer support services had evidence for impacting self-stigma and empowerment. So this suggested that peer support services are one vehicle for reducing self-stigma and its detrimental effects. And it certainly makes sense for anybody who's been involved in those kind of services. You know, the real change in how mental health challenges can be conceptualized from something that might be detrimental to something that can be seen as a strength. The problem is that there's a large number of folks who don't go to peer support services and who might go and leave. And we saw that in our study where it really split down the middle. About half of the people who started at Baltic stayed and the other half left. We saw it in the large consumer operated service provider study that was done in the 90s, where there was a high dropout rate for those agencies. So what this suggests is that we need to do something in the professional sector too. It's not enough to rely just on the peer sector, although what is offered in that sector is invaluable. So this is where David Rowe and Paul Eisaker and I started talking about, well, what are we going to do? What are we going to do that we can do in the professional sector that can have you know, an impact? And so we came up with this treatment that I'll tell you about now that we call narrative enhancement of cognitive therapy. And I'll be pretty quick in my review it since we'll need time for Q&A. And so basically we developed this manualized group intervention that consists of 3 elements. The first is psychoeducation, really counteracting negative stereotypes, replacing them with the myths with facts, cognitive restructuring, sort of teaching skills for how to change negative beliefs about the self, how to change your thoughts about yourself. And the last element is the storytelling exercises, which is the narrative enhancement part, where people participate in this process of telling stories about themselves to other group members, getting feedback from them, and this hopefully facilitating a process of kind of integrating in more empowering themes into your life story and your self-definition. So this is what the manual looks like, the English version. As mentioned in the introduction, it's been translated into a bunch of languages, so I'll just show you the covers for some of those other versions. So this is the Swedish version. You know, they had a little bit bigger budget, put a photo on the cover. This is the Hebrew version from the Israeli implementation, French version. And it's been translated into Spanish as well. So this is just one segment talking about self-stigma, auto-estigma. And it's also been translated into Mandarin. I'm not able to read any of that, but if you are able to read Mandarin, you might be able to check its accuracy, and I can certainly send you the manual and you can see how good a translation it is. So we have research findings from 4 studies, and I'll quickly summarize, that suggest that NECT does have positive effects. And so the first one was what we call a quasi-experimental study that was done in Israel. Then we did a small randomized controlled trial in the US. Then there was a randomized controlled trial done in Gothenburg, Sweden. And then there was a recently completed randomized controlled trial also in the US. So the quasi-experimental study basically compared people who were getting services from 2 different psychiatric rehabilitation centers in Israel. So people were not randomly assigned to them, but they were different service sectors that, different services that served very similar groups of people. And one sector got NECT and the other didn't. And what we found in this study was that the folks who got NECT improved in self-stigma over time, in contrast to treatment as usual. That's what TAU is. They improved in hope and in subjective quality of life. And they also improved substantially in self-esteem, also in contrast to treatment as usual. So this was kind of initially promising findings about the impact of NECT. And this just shows you how, you know, an illustration of the change in self-stigma over the course of the study, from baseline to post-treatment. Okay, and that's, yeah, that's in self-stigma. So I think this is in self-esteem and this is in self-stigma, sorry. Okay, and so we did a small randomized controlled trial also about 10 years ago but we only had 39 people in it. And this was a randomized controlled trial, meaning people were randomly assigned to NECT or treatment as usual. And so in this study, we didn't find significant effects, but we found trends suggesting improvement. And so, but this basically, we concluded from this is we had to do a bigger study, right, to be able to detect the effects that it was having. Before we were able to do that, our colleagues in Gothenburg, Sweden, did a randomized control trial with a waitlist control group. And what they did that was different in this study was that they looked at 6 months after the intervention was done, and whether it's sort of the effects were persisting. And so what they found was that participation in NECT was associated with significant improvement in both self-stigma and self-esteem, and that improvement was sustained at 6 months after the intervention. So this was the publication for that, so we weren't on this one. And basically, and they used the self-stigma mental illness scale, the one that Pat Corrigan developed, and they found that between time 1 and time 2, people in the NECT group decreased in self-stigma, and this decrease was much greater than those in treatment as usual. And they also improved in self-esteem, which didn't occur in treatment as usual. They didn't find a significant change in subjective quality of life, but there was sort of a trend for that. This also shows you how what's the improvement in self-stigma. And then in terms of 6-month follow-up, self-stigma continued to improve over time. So it actually continued to get better, and self-esteem continued to get better. And so this suggests that the effects were enduring. They weren't just these transient things that you might see just at the end of the intervention. So that was sort of encouraging. Okay, and so finally, we've done our more recent study on a larger randomized controlled trial here in the US. This study was done in New Jersey and in Indiana. And it had 170 people in it. And we focused on people who met criteria for schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder and showed evidence of moderate to elevated self-stigma. And they were randomly assigned to NECT or a control group. So it wasn't just treatment as usual. It was, they got an active control group of supportive group therapy. And so, yeah, so it was a diverse group, mostly African-American, mostly middle-aged, sort of not different from what you might see in the public sector in Jersey. And in this case, it was a little bit complicated, but we saw that improvement was much more substantial in the outpatient sites. So we include both partial hospital and outpatient sites. And participants in the outpatient sites showed more significant improvement in self-stigma. So this shows you what it was over the course of 6 months. So we followed people up at 3 and 6 months. And so, like in the Swedish study, we found that the effects were persistent. And so essentially what we found is that it is effective, but it works, it has more stronger effects in lower intensity service settings like outpatient settings. So it just didn't have as big an effect in partial settings where people were getting a lot of different groups, a lot of skills training groups and the like at the same time. So I do think that both peer-led and professional-led interventions can be effective. NECT is one approach. There are other approaches that are out there. Ending self-stigma that Alicia Luckstead and Amy Drapalski have developed. Honest, Open, and Proud that Pat Corrigan has developed is also out there. So these are other approaches that you can also consider implementing. And again, I'm not an expert in them, but I can steer you toward them if you're interested, learning more about them. And that's my big overview. And just plug, if you're interested in getting into this more, if you're really interested in it, I recommend checking out my book, which really goes into greater depth on all of the things I've been talking about, including the community stigma part. So I'm going to stop now, and hopefully we'll have time to address some questions. So I'm going to let Kadi manage that.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Yanos. Yes, we have several questions that came into us via the chat. So I will go into them right now. And one of them is the depression diagnosis higher correlated with self-stigma?
It is not based on the research that was done in that big multi-country European study. So there was actually less, endorsement of elevated self-stigma among those with depression. And this might, not fit with what we think of as, depression is associated with a lot of negative, self-talk, a lot of negative self-definitions, but it's not as negatively stereotyped as schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. So that might explain why.
I see.
We do see a lot of self-stigma and PTSD. So we have done research with people with PTSD diagnoses, and rates of self-stigma were actually just as high in that study.
Very interesting. Okay, I noted that as well. We had another question here by one of our colleagues at our department. Did individuals who went through NECT, who improved in self-esteem and decreased in self-stigma, show a positive impact in other ways, such as increased employment pursuits and outcomes?
Yeah, so unfortunately, we did not see significant changes in those aspects of social functioning or community participation, which is really what we're most interested in, right? So that's really kind of the part of recovery that we're most interested in. So we, of course, we want people to feel better about themselves. We also want them to kind of engage in life as they see fit. And we had a lot of stories of that in the groups, and I was supervising the groups, and there was a lot of that was coming across, but it didn't show up in the data. So I think it's something where we think that it might take longer, and it might be, maybe there needs to be a synergistic effect too, so like we see with cognitive remediation,
Mhm.
where it only really works when you combine it with psych rehab, they both benefit. So it might be that that needs to happen as well. You need to give people opportunity at the same time as giving them a different way of looking at themselves.
Thank you. Thank you. And then I had one question that came up for me as you were going along. How do you think now, with many initiatives that workplaces are implementing on diversity and inclusion, right? How do you think this can help address and reduce internalized stigma?
Well, I think positive identities related to race, ethnicity, or sexual minority status, or gender identity, these are all positives for people, right? So it's important that a person can find identities that are that they can define themselves in a positive way, right?
Right, right.
So I think it's a good thing, generally speaking. I think more community around movements is also a potential strength, right? So if someone is getting involved in Black Lives Matter, or they're getting involved in the LGBTQ movement, that's going to help them too. There's going to be social support. We
Right.
do have reports of people feeling rejected by those movements at times as well, which is disheartening.
Mhm.
So we did do a study on people who identified as both LGBT and having a serious mental illness, and people talked about dual alienation, where they felt like they didn't fit in either community. So, but I think generally it's a positive.
Thank you. And then, in the interest of time, we're approaching
Yeah.
the top of the hour. So,
Mhm.
we have one more question. Is your manual published in an ebook, or I think somebody
Yeah,
wanted?
it's a PDF. So if you email me, I'll send it to you.
Okay,
It's not online. It's not posted anywhere, but I've sent it to everybody's asked for it. So just send me an email.
perfect.
If you don't have my email, I'm going to put it in chat right now.
That was my next question.
Yeah, so I'll just
Thank
put it
you.
in there right now for you. It's
Okay,
Yanos@jjay.cuny.edu. So feel free to ask me for it, and I will send it to you. And I can do trainings too. I did do one via distance technology, so it can be done. So if a place wants that, I can work it out.
Thank you. That's a very valuable resource to share with our community, especially the psychiatric rehab community and the mental health community at large. So I want to thank everyone once again. Thank you, Dr. Yanos, for joining us and for presenting on today's topic. As a reminder, I will be following up with everyone regarding our survey. The completion of these surveys is linked to our funding, our continued funding. So we really encourage you to participate, and we will be posting the Zoom recording of this webinar to our website. I will also send an email announcement about that, and as well as our presenter slides. So we hope you enjoy the rest of your day. We hope that you remain safe and well. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us with any questions or concerns. Thank you.
Thanks again for having me.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.